Never underestimate the power of thirst, because for 20,000 Crusaders, thirst was a horrific death sentence. In July 1187, one of the deadliest armies of the Middle Ages was destroyed not by swords or arrows, but by a siege of smoke, embers, and a single drop of water cast away before their dying eyes. They were marching straight into one of the most brutal traps in the history of the Middle East. And the mastermind behind it all? A man who initially fought his fellow Muslims more often than his European enemies, Saladin. What happened on that day was no accident, but rather the result of an extraordinarily meticulous military strategy. The paths leading to water sources had been secured beforehand, while every attempt by the Crusaders to break through the encirclement was consistently thwarted by fast-moving light cavalry attacks. They were forced to march continuously under the scorching sun without any opportunity to rest or replenish their water supplies. When night fell, the suffering did not end. Exhaustion, dehydration, and despair continued to erode the troops' morale. The following day, fires were deliberately set to the grass that had dried up due to the summer season. The wind carried thick smoke directly toward the Crusader ranks, making them even thirstier and causing them to lose their orientation. It is said that in front of the soldiers dying of dehydration, water was a sight so close yet impossible for them to reach. Within hours, the military force that had dominated the Kingdom of Jerusalem for decades turned into an exhausted, scattered army that was barely able to lift their weapons. They were stepping toward one of the most decisive military disasters in the history of the Crusades, the Battle of Hattin. The mastermind behind this entire extraordinary operation was Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known in the West as Saladin. Born in 1137 or 1138 in the city of Tikrit, located in modern-day Iraq, Saladin came from a Kurdish family that served the Zengid dynasty. Interestingly, early in his career, he was more involved in political and military conflicts among Muslim rulers than in facing European armies. Along with his uncle Shirkuh, he joined an expedition to Egypt before eventually being appointed as vizier, and later establishing the Ayyubid dynasty. Through his diplomatic skills, political intelligence, and military leadership, Saladin successfully united Egypt, Syria, Hejaz, and most of the Arabian Peninsula under a single command, something that had previously been difficult to achieve due to internal divisions within the Islamic world. Unlike many warlords of his era who relied solely on brutal force to win, Saladin was famous for his patience in devising strategies, his ability to read his opponent's weaknesses, and his outstanding logistical discipline. All of these qualities culminated in the summer of 1187, when he successfully trapped the Crusader army in a terrain that left them with no chance of survival. The victory at Hattin subsequently paved the way for the recapture of Jerusalem a few months later, ensuring Saladin's name would be remembered as one of the greatest military strategists in world history. Before his name was revered as the conqueror of Jerusalem and one of history's greatest commanders, Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi spent nearly 4 decades of his life pursuing a mission that many of his contemporaries deemed impossible: uniting a fractured Islamic world. Since the collapse of the Seljuk dynasty's power, the Middle East had been plagued by rivalries among Muslim rulers who vied for territory, power, and influence. Egypt was ruled by the Shia Fatimid dynasty, while Syria and Mesopotamia were under Sunni rulers who were often busier fighting one another than facing the threat posed by the Crusader states. This situation provided a massive advantage to the Crusader states that had been established in the Levant since the success of the First Crusade in 1099. For decades, they managed to maintain power not only due to their military strength, but also because their opponents remained divided. Salahuddin understood that as long as Muslims were fractured by political ambitions and internal conflicts, reclaiming Jerusalem would remain nothing more than an unattainable dream. Through a combination of political wit, diplomacy, and military success, Salahuddin gradually built a foundation of unity that had not been achieved for generations. After taking control of Egypt and ending Fatimid rule, he progressively integrated Egypt, Syria, Hejaz, Yemen, and parts of Mesopotamia into a single powerhouse under the Ayyubid dynasty. This process was far from peaceful. He had to confront rebellions, aristocratic rivalries, and wars against fellow Muslim rulers who refused to submit. Yet behind every victory, Saladin always prioritized reconciliation over revenge, offering cooperation to his former enemies for the sake of a greater cause. He cultivated an image as a just, religious leader who was capable of putting the community's interests above personal ambition. Thanks to this reputation, when he called for a jihad to reclaim the Holy Land, thousands of soldiers from various regions came forward to join. Not out of coercion, but because they believed that for the first time in decades, the Islamic world had a leader capable of guiding them to victory. Meanwhile, the situation within the Kingdom of Jerusalem was moving in the exact opposite direction. Following the death of King Baldwin IV, the leper king, who had successfully maintained the political balance of his kingdom for years, Jerusalem fell into a succession crisis that weakened the government. The new king, Guy de Lusignan, was considered inexperienced and failed to unite the competing nobles. Amidst this chaos emerged one of the most controversial nobles in the Crusader world, Raynald of Chatillon. Notorious for his brutal nature, stubbornness, and penchant for violating peace treaties, Raynald repeatedly attacked Muslim trade caravans, even while a truce was in effect. The climax occurred when he plundered a large caravan carrying merchants and pilgrims heading to Mecca. Wealth was seized, passengers were taken captive, and some sources even note that Raynald arrogantly rejected demands to release the prisoners while mocking Saladin's threats of retaliation. This act was not merely an ordinary robbery. It was a direct insult to the honor and security of Muslims, as well as a flagrant breach of agreed treaties. This was the exact moment Saladin had been waiting for over the years. By capitalizing on the widespread outrage throughout the Islamic world, he successfully united rulers, scholars, and commanders under a single banner. Through meticulous diplomacy, powerful charismatic leadership, and mature military planning, he formed the largest coalition the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever faced. However, his primary objective was not merely to assault Crusader fortresses, but rather to lure them away from their secure defensive positions into an open battlefield where he could crush their main army in a single, decisive confrontation. The trap was named the Horns of Hattin, a volcanic plateau located west of Lake Tiberias, featuring two peaks resembling horns. To someone unfamiliar with the terrain, the area looked like an ordinary hill. But to Saladin Al-Ayyubi, Hattin was the perfect location to obliterate the largest army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Months before the battle took place, he had studied the enemy's movement paths, weather conditions, and the location of every single spring that served as a source of life in that arid region. Saladin understood that in the summer heat of July, water was far more valuable than gold or swords. For this reason, he did not rush to secure a victory through direct combat. Instead, he first seized control of all the springs and wells along the route the Crusader army was likely to traverse. Through this strategy, he forced his opponents into a long journey across a barren wasteland without any opportunity to replenish their water supplies. Every step the enemy took had actually been calculated, and without realizing it, they were walking into a trap they could not possibly evade. When the forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem finally arrived near Hattin, they were on the brink of collapse. The Middle Eastern summer sun beat down mercilessly, while the iron armor, shields, and weapons they carried turned into a burden that tortured their bodies. The soldiers' lips were chapped, their throats felt as if they were on fire, and many war horses began to collapse from exhaustion and thirst. Their last hope was to reach Lake Tiberias, but every path leading to the water source had already been secured by Saladin's forces. They were forced to set up camp on dry, rocky ground without a single drop of water to drink. The night that should have been a time for rest instead turned into an unyielding torture. From all directions, Salahuddin's troops surrounded them while continuously beating war drums, sounding trumpets, and chanting the takbir throughout the night. The echoing, ceaseless noise prevented the Crusader soldiers from closing their eyes. As fatigue began to overpower their bodies, the night wind carried thick plumes of black smoke from the dry grass that had been intentionally set ablaze around the camp. Smoke filled the air, making eyes sting, breath grow shallower, and the already unbearable thirst significantly more agonizing. The fire was not just a physical weapon, but a psychological warfare tool designed to shatter the opponent's fighting spirit before the sun rose again.
The morning of July 4th, 1187, marked the end of one of the most powerful armies in the medieval Christian world. Severely dehydrated, sleep-deprived, and lacking coordination, the Crusader ranks began to fracture as they attempted to break through the encirclement to reach the water source still visible in the distance. However, every attempt they made was consistently beaten back by showers of arrows and rapid attacks from Muslim-like cavalry, who struck and vanished before a counterattack could be mounted. Despair began to overcome the soldiers. Many dropped their weapons because they no longer possessed the energy to fight. Popular tradition even recounts that Salahuddin's forces displayed or used water in front of the enemy as a form of psychological pressure, emphasizing how impossible it was for them to obtain even a single drop to survive. Ultimately, when the main assault was launched, the Crusaders' resistance crumbled in a short time. King Guy de Lusignan was successfully captured alive, while Reynald of Chatillon, the figure who triggered the outbreak of war through his violation of the peace treaty and attacks on Muslim caravans, was captured and subsequently executed by order of Salahuddin. The most sacred relic belonging to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the True Cross, also fell into the hands of the Muslim forces. The victory at Hattin was not just a success on the battlefield. This engagement shattered the primary military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and paved the way for Salahuddin to recapture Jerusalem just a few months later, altering the course of Crusade history forever. The brilliant victory at the Horns of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, became the greatest turning point in the history of the Crusades. In a single day, the main military force of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was practically destroyed. Most of their elite troops were killed or captured. Their highest leaders fell into the hands of Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi, and the sacred relic of the True Cross, which had served as a spiritual and moral symbol for the Crusaders, was successfully captured. Without a field force capable of defending its territories, fortress after fortress of the Kingdom of Jerusalem began to surrender one by one. Key cities such as Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon, Sidon, Beirut, and Caesarea gradually returned to the control of the Ayyubid forces. The path to Jerusalem was now wide open. After nearly 88 years under Crusader rule since its capture in 1099, the city considered holy by three of the world's major religions was finally within the reach of the Islamic world once more. For Salahuddin, the ultimate goal was not merely to win a war, but to reclaim Jerusalem without repeating the bloody tragedies that had stained the city's history. When the Muslim army besieged Jerusalem in September 1187, many of the city's inhabitants were consumed by fear. They still remembered how the Crusaders, when capturing the city nearly 9 decades earlier, carried out a mass slaughter of Muslim and Jewish residents. The fear that a similar retaliation would occur filled the atmosphere inside the city with panic. However, what unfolded was entirely different. Following a negotiation process with the commander of Jerusalem's defense, Balian of Ibelin, Salahuddin accepted the surrender of the city under relatively lenient terms. Christian residents were given the opportunity to ransom their freedom, while those who could not afford it were, in many cases, freed through funds paid by Salahuddin himself, his family, or his commanders. Churches remained protected, Christian holy sites were not destroyed, and pilgrims were still permitted to visit Jerusalem in the periods that followed. This policy stood in stark contrast to the events of 1099, when thousands of residents were slaughtered after the Crusaders successfully took the city. Salahuddin's choice of negotiation, compassion, and respect for the civilian population led many Christian chroniclers of the time, even those from Europe, to acknowledge the greatness of character in the enemy they faced. 6 years after that victory, precisely in the year 1193, Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi passed away in Damascus after suffering from an illness. His departure left behind profound grief, not only among his people and soldiers, but also in the eyes of many opponents who had faced him. Although he ruled an empire stretching from Egypt to Syria and controlled various wealthy cities in the Middle East, his personal life was famously modest. Historians' records state that when all his personal wealth was counted after his death, very little remained, only a single gold dinar coin and 36 silver dirhams, because the majority of his wealth had been distributed to help the poor, widows, orphans, and social causes. It was even mentioned that these funds were insufficient to cover his entire funeral procession, making assistance from his closest companions necessary. The greatest legacy he left behind was not magnificent palaces or piles of gold, but a reputation that transcended the boundaries of religion and civilization. To the Islamic world, he is remembered as a unifier of the community and the liberator of Jerusalem. To many European writers, he became a symbol of chivalry who upheld honor, generosity, and the ethics of war. Centuries later, the name of Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi continues to be revered, not just as a general who won battles, but as a leader who proved that true victory is achieved not only through the power of weapons, but also through justice, forgiveness, and a sense of humanity capable of reshaping how history remembers a conqueror.